Tonight, drift back to a world where you cannot simply reach into your wardrobe and choose your coat. Where the loaf in the market square changes size from one season to the next, but the penny you pay for it never changes at all. Where a stretch of ordinary woodland belongs, by ancient and exact law, to the king's deer rather than to any living man who walks beneath the oak boughs. And where, after a certain bell rings from the church tower at dusk, you may not walk freely in your own street without attracting the attention of the watch. You are living, somewhere around the year 1280, in an England threaded through with rules. Not one set of rules, not one neat law handed down from a single authority, but a dozen overlapping systems pressing in from every direction at once. The manor court holds you to custom. The church court holds you to canon. The town holds you to its borough regulations. The guild holds you to the mystery of your trade. The king's forest holds you to the law of the vert and the venison. And behind all of these, quieter and older than any of them, the village itself holds you to what has always been done. It is, to a sleepy modern ear, an oddly comforting thought. A whole world held in place by custom and statute and unwritten expectation, every act hedged about, every morning beginning with a set of small rules that had been observed long before your grandmother was born and would be observed long after your grandchildren would dust. A man dressing at dawn reaches for the coat the law allows him. A baker stamps his mark into the crust of every loaf before setting it in the oven. A man walking home after dark slows his step when he sees the watchman's lantern ahead. The rules tonight are strange by our lights. Some are precise and written down in Latin on parchment rolls, sealed with wax, filed in the king's chancery. Some were never written at all and could not have been, because they lived only in the collective memory of the village, in what everyone knew, what everyone expected, what no one would have thought to question. But all of them, taken together, describe a world where every small act was held in place by something. And that, when you are tired enough, is a comfort. Settle in. Let the night do its work. Picture yourself in the year 1363, in a townhouse somewhere in the English Midlands, on a cold morning in early spring. The fire is already caught and climbing, the room warming slowly from the night's chill, and you are standing at the oak chest where your clothing is folded and stored. You are a merchant of moderate means, a man who trades in wool, who owns a house and a warehouse, and a small counting table set beneath the window where the light is best, who earns perhaps £35 in a good year, which is a respectable sum and considerably more than your father ever managed. And you are looking at a length of silk. It is a beautiful thing. A deep blue, close woven, smooth to the hand in a way that wool, even good English wool, simply is not. It carries the smell of somewhere else, somewhere south and warm and very different from the damp Midlands morning outside your shutters. It was brought up from London at considerable trouble and expense by a contact who knows a contact who knows a Flemish dealer who had it from a merchant who had it from further east than either of them could confidently name. You have owned it for 3 months, turning it over in your hands on quiet evenings, thinking about what it might become. It would make a fine surcoat, a long outer garment that would sit well over your wool tunic, that would catch the eye at the Guildhall dinner and at the mayor's table. It would set you apart at the market in a way that your wool coat, however well made, cannot quite do. And you cannot wear it. Not because you cannot afford it. You can, more or less, if you are careful with the rest of the quarter's accounts. But because the law says you cannot. The Statute of Apparel, passed by Parliament that very year under Edward III, has laid down in careful and quite specific detail who may wear what, at what income level, in what position in the social order. Cloth of gold, cloth embroidered with gold or silver thread, the richest foreign silks. These are for the royal family only. Purple silk goes the same way, straight to the crown and no further. Below that, the furs, sable, ermine, the warm belly plush of the most expensive northern pelts, reserved for those with land worth £100 a year or more, which is a knight at the lower end and a great lord at the upper. For merchants worth under £40 a year, silk itself is a closed door. The velvet and satin that a knight's wife might wear are barred to an esquire's wife. The esquire's wife's allowances are in turn barred to the wife of a gentleman below the esquire's rank. Every rung of the social ladder has its designated cloth, and the statute has itemized them with a thoroughness that must have required considerable patience from the clerks who wrote it out. The logic behind the statute is not quite the logic you might first expect. It is not simply envy or spite on the part of those at the top of the pile, though one cannot entirely rule that out as a contributing sentiment. The stated aim, the language Parliament used, which was frank about it, was that a man should be legible by his dress. You should be able to look at a person crossing the market square and know, from what they wore, roughly who they were. What rank, what income, what place in the order of things. Dressing above your station was, in the eyes of the law, a kind of lie. You were presenting yourself as something you were not. You were making a false claim about the world, stitched into cloth and carried through the public streets on your own body where everyone could see it. There is a whole vocabulary of rank written into the fabric of English life at this moment. Wool is the everyday cloth, the cloth of the common world, produced in 10,000 village cottages on 10,000 winter evenings, spun and woven and fulled and dyed into the serviceable garments of the majority. English wool is excellent. It is the wool that funds the king's wars, that fills the Flemish looms at Ghent and Bruges, that pays the church its tithes and the crown its customs duties. The entire English economy is built, in large part, on the backs of sheep. And there is nothing wrong with wool, nothing inferior about it, nothing to be ashamed of in a coat that is warm and well made and appropriately dyed. But silk is imported, costly, technically demanding to weave in the pattern work and drape that makes it beautiful and distinctive, and therefore a marker of wealth and connection and rank that the statute wants to keep pinned to the correct person. The correct person is not you if your income falls below the line. By today's standards, the idea that the government would legislate the precise contents of your wardrobe seems almost impossible to grasp. There is no off-the-peg shop here, no freedom to dress as you like within whatever budget you happen to have accumulated. No fashion industry in any modern sense, no seasonal collection, no question of whether this year's colour suits you. No concept of expressing your personality through your choices of fabric and cut. What you could wear was decided not by your taste or your purse or your personality, but by your position in the social order as Parliament understood it. Your coat was, in a very real sense, your name badge, worn before you spoke a word, read before you opened your mouth, fixed before you had woken up that morning. The statute described the permitted furs in considerable detail. Miniver, the delicate white belly fur of the squirrel, was available to those of certain ranks. Sable was not permitted below a specific income threshold. Ermine, the winter coat of the stoat, black-tipped and white, was strictly for the great. The gradations were precise enough that an observer with sufficient knowledge could, in principle, scan a street and assign approximate incomes from the fur trim alone. The pointed shoes known as poulaines, whose extreme length the fashion-conscious had been pushing further and further, the toes curling up in elaborate curves, would later be regulated by length according to rank, though the specific statute for shoes came in the following century under Edward IV, and is worth knowing the date if you were going to mention it. Consider what all this meant for the cloth itself, and for the people who made it. The dyers of an English town occupied a particular and unglamorous corner of the economic world. Their trade was pushed to the river's edge, or to the downwind side of the borough, because the smell of the vats, urine for fixing the mordant, oak gall for the tannins, woad boiled to a paste, was the kind of smell a neighbourhood could not quietly absorb. They produced the blues and reds and blacks and greens that the statute had just decided were a map of rank. A deep, even dye was technically demanding. The cloth had to be fully scoured to take the colour cleanly. The mordant had to be fresh. The temperature of the vat had to be managed by hand and eye and experience across an afternoon. A well-dyed scarlet, the colour that required the most expensive dye stuff, was a visible statement that a blotchy, uneven one simply was not. And if you could not wear the colour your money might have bought, if the statute had placed it above your income, then the dyer's skill was, for you, purely academic. You would specify the permitted shade, and the dyer would produce it, and the coat would be warm and serviceable and correct. What did wool actually feel like against the skin, when it was the best your £35 entitled you to wear? Better than you might imagine, though the comparison requires some work. A well-fulled broadcloth, the kind made from English wool that had been woven, wetted, beaten in the fulling mill until the fibres locked together into a surface almost as smooth as felt, then stretched on a frame to dry with the nap raised and sheared flat, had a softness that was not silk softness, but was a softness of its own kind. Warm. Substantial. The kind of cloth that held its shape across a morning's market and still looked the part in the afternoon. Your permitted £35 coat was, by any reasonable standard, an excellent coat. The statute had closed the door on silk and on the great furs, but it had left you with something genuinely good. That, too, is part of the story. The permitted things were not poor things. They were simply not the best things. And in a world where the best things were very specifically reserved, the not best things carried their own quiet dignity. Here is where the story gets genuinely interesting. the law was reissued. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly across the decades that followed the 1363 statute. New statutes tinkered with the categories, adjusted the income thresholds, added this fabric, removed that one, refined the exception for the wives of craftsmen of certain standing. And scholars looking at the historical record find something telling in all this repetition. A law that works does not need to be reenacted every few years. A law that keeps coming back to Parliament in slightly adjusted form is a law that is not quite working on the ground. The sumptuary statutes, for all their precision and all their careful gradations, were largely aspirational. A document of what the elite wished the world to look like, rather than a tight description of what people actually wore. The wealthy merchant went right on acquiring the blue silk, or something that came close enough to pass in most company. The merchant's wife found her way to the velvet trim by some arrangement or other, some judgment about what could be overlooked in practice, even if not in law. The fines were levied occasionally. Cases were brought before the courts from time to time. Examples were made in patches. But the broad tide of English commerce and human vanity moved around the statutes rather than being damned by them. People have always wanted to dress above their station. People have always found that the impulse to look the part is considerably stronger than the rule against it, particularly when enforcement is inconsistent and the statute has to be reissued every decade because it keeps being flouted. Still, the law was there. It was real. It was passed by Parliament. It was enforced in patches and observed in some degree by many who read it, and it tells us something true about the world of 1363. In that world, dress was not self-expression. It was not an aesthetic choice or a form of creativity or a mode of presenting personality. It was a legible signal, a piece of information about rank and station that the whole community could read as easily as reading a letter, and that carried the same authority as any other publicly legible fact about a person. The gentleman's gown and the merchant's gown and the labourer's gown were different not only because the labourer could not afford the gentleman's cloth, but because the system required them to be different, had written that requirement into law, sealed it with the royal seal, and sent it to the market towns where people would have to live with it or pay for ignoring it. You fold the silk carefully and set it back in the chest. You put on the good wool coat, the one appropriate to your £35 a year, the one that says merchant plainly enough to anyone who cares to look. It fits well, because it has been made well for a man who can afford good making. It is warm, because wool is warm. And the morning comes in through the window in its usual grey and gold, indifferent to every statute in the kingdom, and you go to work, wearing exactly what the law has decided is yours to wear. The rules of cloth could feel, from the outside, like a cage. But there is another way to hold them. They were a structure that told everyone exactly where they stood, that made the social world legible in ways that mattered deeply in a society without formal credentials, without business cards, without the dozen small means we now have of establishing who we are to a stranger at a glance. The coat did the work. It spoke for you before you could speak for yourself. On a cold spring morning, standing at an open chest, deciding what to wear was not a choice. It was a confirmation, And there was, in that, a certain ease. Not the ease of freedom, but the ease of a world that had already decided and left you one less thing to think about. The merchant locks the chest and sets out through the familiar street. His wool coat, the right one, the permitted one, carries him through the morning toward another day's ordinary business, every thread of it exactly as it should be. Step now into the market of a middling English town, somewhere in the 1300s, on a market day in late autumn. The stalls are set out around the market cross, the town bell has marked the opening hour, and the smells are the usual layered tangle of a busy market morning: wet wool, horse, mud, old leather, and the sharp and very good smell of fresh baked bread drifting from the baker's stall 2 rows down. You are a baker. The good news: there is a fire and bread is coming. The bad news: there are rules about the bread, detailed and ancient rules, and the market officer's balance can appear at any moment. You have been up since well before dawn. Since the hour the first light was a mere grey intimation on the eastern horizon, and the yard was still so dark you had to feel your way across it to the woodpile, your breath coming out in clouds that you could feel before you could see them. You have loaded the beehive oven, judging the heat by the feel of the air inside the dome, and by the colour of a scrap of paper you hold briefly in the entrance, watching how quickly it scorches. A test your father taught you, and his father before him, because there is no thermometer here, no dial on the oven face, no digital readout telling you the temperature to within a degree. You judge it with your hands and your face and a piece of paper, and the knowledge that comes from doing this every morning for years. You have set the loaves to rise, watched them, turned them, set them to bake, pulled them at the right moment by instinct and smell, and rested them on the board to cool while you loaded the next batch. Your hands are still floury along the knuckles. Your face is warm and a little raw from the long morning's work beside the oven. And you are setting out your trays at the market stall with a particular, watchful care that is not simple professional pride, but something closer to self-preservation. Because there are rules about bread. Detailed, specific, ancient rules, and you are subject to every one of them, and the market officer with the scales could come at any moment. The assize of bread and ale was established in its English form under Henry III in 1266, and it is quite possibly the first English law to regulate the production and sale of food. Its central mechanism is simple in the stating and genuinely strange in the thinking. It does not fix the price of bread. It fixes the weight. The price of a penny loaf is always 1 penny. The penny stays the penny, as steady and immovable as the market cross. But the size of the loaf moves with the current price of wheat. When wheat is cheap, after a good harvest and a dry summer and a mild autumn, your penny loaf is large and heavy, enough bread to make a real meal of. When wheat is dear, after a wet spring or a failed crop or a cold summer that kept the grain from ripening, your penny loaf shrinks accordingly. The customer pays the same coin each time and gets more or less bread depending on what the wheat harvest has done this year, without the coin ever being given a different name, without the price ever being formally announced as having changed. By today's standards, this is a very peculiar way to think about pricing. We are accustomed to a world where the loaf on the shelf has a label, and when costs rise, the number on the label goes up. Here, the number is fixed as if it were a physical law, and the product itself absorbs the fluctuations of the wheat market rather than the price. The penny is as steady as a stone. The loaf is the variable, the thing that adjusts so that the transaction can always be conducted for the same coin. It sounds strange, but consider what it accomplishes. In a world without printed price lists, without the ability to calculate quickly, without widespread literacy, a price that never changes is a price that everyone knows and no one can be deceived about. The penny. Always the penny. The question is only what size of loaf you receive for it today, which is a question anyone can evaluate by lifting it and feeling its weight. You know what size you should be giving because the assize is publicly posted, read out in the market by the town's officers, chalked at the Guildhall, known to every baker in the town and to a good many customers as well, who have been buying bread long enough to know when a loaf feels light. And you have your baker's mark, a particular stamp pressed into the crust of every loaf before it goes into the oven, marking it with a sign that is yours and no one else's, so that if a light loaf is found, when the market officer sets it on the balance and the arm moves the wrong way, it can be traced directly back to you and not to the baker at the next stall who would be quite reasonably indignant about being blamed. Your mark is your guarantee, your signature pressed in dough, and also, on a bad day, your confession. A light loaf was a serious matter, graduated by the seriousness of the offence. The first time, a fine recorded in the town's rolls, painful financially, but not ruinous if it stayed at that. The second time, a heavier fine, and a warning that carried the real possibility of what came next. The third time, or when the shortfall was too brazen to explain as accident, the pillory waited in the marketplace. Head and hands locked in the wooden boards, a morning spent in the market square where you had been selling bread all morning, the opportunity for your neighbours and customers to express their opinions about your honesty in whatever manner the market had to hand. It is recounted here gently, because it was, by the standards of the age, at the gentler end of the punitive scale. Public embarrassment rather than serious physical harm, a few hours of shame and then release, then back to your oven. The penalty that the more serious or persistent offender really feared was the destruction of the oven itself. That was the actual ruin, not the mourning in the boards, but the smashing of the tool that produced your livelihood. No oven, no bread. No bread, no income. No income, no house. The market officer who actually enforced all of this is worth a moment's attention, because he is the hinge on which the whole system turned. He was not a distant official, not a representative of some central authority in London. He was a local man, appointed by the town's governing body, known to the bakers he assessed and to the customers who bought from them, walking a market he had walked 100 times before. He carried a set of weights and a balance, a pair of scale pans on a central pivot, the instrument of commercial truth in a world without any other reliable way to verify a claim about quantity. When he set a loaf on one pan and the standard weight on the other and the arm moved, everyone nearby could see which way it moved. There was no ambiguity in the balance, no room for debate about the outcome, No argument to be made that the officer had misread a dial or entered a number wrong. The arm moved. The loaf was either the weight the assize required or it was not. You have been at this long enough to know the balance's moods. You know the way a loaf looks when it is going to sit correctly on the pan, the colour of the crust, the way the mark you pressed into the dough before baking has lifted and opened in the heat, the sound the base makes when you tap it with a knuckle, a hollow note that tells you the crumb has set. The oven is the other variable, the one that most often goes wrong. There is no thermometer here, no dial on the oven face, no printed guide telling you the correct temperature. You judge the heat with a piece of paper held briefly into the opening and withdrawn quickly, watching whether it scorches or merely yellows, and with the flat of your hand passed over the dome's mouth, feeling where the warmth is most intense, and comparing it by memory to every other morning you have done this. The knowledge is in the hands and in the eyes, not in any instrument, and it took years to acquire and cannot be written down in any way that would convey what it actually means in practice. A loaf baked in an oven that ran a little cool comes out pale and dense, and may sit heavier on the balance than a well-baked loaf of the same dough. A loaf baked in an oven running hot sets its crust early and can hollow inside, lighter than it should be. You are managing all of this by feel, every morning, and the balance is waiting in the market to check your work. Now here is the part of the bread story that has come down to us wrapped inside an everyday phrase that most people use without knowing where it comes from. The baker's dozen. 13, where you might reasonably expect 12. The traditional account, and it is the traditional account, the story that bakers told and that passed along through the centuries with the plausibility that makes something stick, is that a baker, when selling a batch of 12 loaves, would add a 13th as insurance. A precautionary surplus, a hedge against the balance tipping the wrong way. If your 12 loaves run slightly light today, because the dough behaved differently than yesterday, because the temperature in the oven was not quite what you thought, because flour is not a perfectly consistent material and neither are human hands, the 13th loaf makes up the deficit on the balance, and you have not broken the assize. The extra loaf is the margin of safety, the small, generous buffer that stands between you and the pillory on a bad day. Whether this is the precise and original reason historians will continue to debate. The mechanism is plausible. The incentive is very real. The assize made short weight a costly and public risk, and bakers had excellent reason to err toward generosity rather than shortfall when in any doubt. What is certain is that when you next hear someone ask for a baker's dozen, somewhere inside that phrase is a medieval baker on a cold market morning, squinting at a balance, deciding that 13 was the wiser number, and being right. There is a comfort in the assize, if you consider it from the customer's side. In a world without consumer protection agencies, without trading standards, officers with clipboards, without the ability to look up reviews on a screen, without any of the machinery we now use to navigate a marketplace with some confidence, the assize of bread was a guarantee woven into the daily transaction itself. The penny loaf, wherever in this town you bought it, from whichever stall you chose or could afford to reach, had been weighed against a known standard and made by a baker whose mark was on the crust. The price never moved, never surprised you, never required negotiation or mental arithmetic. You handed over your penny, and the loaf was what it was. Fixed by law, weighed by custom, marked with a man's name. The assize was also a contract of sorts between the baker and the town. By setting your mark in the crust, you were saying, I made this, I vouch for it, I am the person to find if something is wrong. The community, by buying from you and not from the baker who was known to run light, was enforcing that contract through the simple daily mechanism of preference and reputation. The market officer's balance was the formal enforcement. The customer's memory was the daily one. You set the last of your loaves on the tray and straighten your back, feeling the long morning in the muscles between your shoulder blades. The market is filling now, the voices rising over the cold air, the light strengthening as the sun clears the last of the rooftops to the east. Each loaf marked, each loaf the right weight for this morning's wheat price, each loaf the penny price that it has always been and will always be. The strange comfort of a price that never moves is not nothing in a world where so many things fluctuate and shift and fail to hold. At the market cross, at least, the rules are known. The scales are ready. The mark is in the crust. The bread is the right weight. And somewhere in the crowd, a customer is lifting your loaf and nodding because it feels correct in the hand. They place their penny on the board. The transaction completes as it has every market day for as long as anyone can remember under the same rule for the same price, marked with the same kind of baker's mark that has been in the crust since the assize was first read in this market. The penny loaf is the penny loaf. This is what it means for a rule to work. Step outside the town now, past the last houses, past the ditch and the straggling hedge that marks the edge of the cultivated world, out onto the rough ground at the margin of the forest. Not the forest you might picture from a walk in the country today. Not the managed wood with its paths and its laminated map at the gate, with all the things you are and are not permitted to do printed out in clear language. This is the King's Forest, and it operates by a different set of rules from anything you know in the world we live in now. A royal forest in medieval England was not defined by whether trees grew in it. This is the first thing to understand, because it is the thing that most surprises people who hear it for the first time. It was a legal jurisdiction, a tract of land, sometimes including villages, open heathland, farmsteads, rivers, and common grazing ground, set aside under forest law for the king's deer and boar and the vegetation those animals needed to survive and thrive. At the height of the forest system, somewhere around the late 12th century, perhaps a third of England lay under some form of forest law. Not a third of the woodland. A third of the land. Including land where people lived and worked and grew their crops and kept their animals, all of it now subject to a parallel system of courts and officers and regulations that ran alongside the ordinary world of the manor and the parish, without quite merging with either answerable not to the local lord but directly to the king. The technical term for the vegetation the deer depended on was the vert, from the French for green, meaning all the greenery the beasts required, the browse and the undergrowth and the young shoots, and the leaf cover that provided them with both food and shelter. You did not cut the vert without a license. You did not take timber from the king's trees, not even the timber lying already, fallen on the ground, not without the proper authorization from the proper officer. You did not graze your cattle or your sheep in the protected areas of the forest without permission secured in advance. You did not set a trap that might accidentally catch one of the king's beasts rather than the rabbit or the fox you intended. And you did not hunt the deer. Not the hart, not the hind, not the fawn. They were the king's, as surely as if they had been stamped with his seal. The system that protected them was elaborate. The verderers were the forest's own judges, elected in the county court and responsible for hearing presentments of offences against the venison and the vert in the forest courts known as swain motes and justice seats. The regarders made periodic inspections of the forest's boundaries and its general condition, noting any encroachments or assaults. Land cleared from forest for cultivation without permission. The agisters managed the grazing rights that were permitted to commoners during specified seasons, collecting the fees for pannage and for the common of pasture. The foresters themselves walked the ground, watching, noting, reporting. It was a bureaucracy entirely its own, running parallel to the ordinary world of manor court and church court, touching both at certain points but ultimately answerable to a different authority and serving a different purpose. In this forest, even your dog was subject to the law. Working dogs kept in or near the forest were required to be lawed, a process known as expeditation that rendered them unable to run deer. The details of exactly how this was accomplished varied by time and by local custom, but the principle was consistent. A large dog in or near the king's forest was a dog that posed a risk to the king's venison, and the risk had to be managed. The record of your dog's lawing was noted by the forest officers. You kept your dog. The dog could not course deer. The forest administration moved on to its next concern. Now here is where the story of the king's forest touches the title of this episode in its most literal way, and also where it softens and corrects itself almost immediately. Under the early Norman kings, under William the Conqueror and his sons, the penalties for taking the king's venison were severe in ways that are worth naming plainly. The harshest punishments at the peak of the system included blinding and mutilation. A man caught killing a royal deer might, under William, lose his eyes. This is the historical extreme, the ceiling of what forest law could do at its most uncompromising. It is the point on the scale that is genuinely close to what the title claims, and it is attested in the sources. But here is what happened next, and this is what matters for the long life of the story. In 1217, 2 years after Magna Carta, a companion document was issued, the Charter of the Forest. Where Magna Carta had addressed the political grievances of the great barons against the king's arbitrary power, the Charter of the Forest addressed the grievances of ordinary people, the commoners and the free men who lived in and around the royal forests and whose daily lives were most directly shaped by forest law. Clause 10 of the Charter abolished the penalties of death and mutilation for taking a deer from the royal forest. It reduced the punishment to fines and to imprisonment, placing deer theft on the level of a serious property offence rather than a crime against the royal body that might cost you your sight. And the Charter also restored commoners' rights that the expansion of the forest system had gradually eroded. The right to collect deadwood for fuel. Estover. The right to run pigs in the forest during the pannage season. The right to pasture animals in the unenclosed parts. The harshest rule in this entire episode, the one nearest to the title's literal claim, is the one that was most deliberately, most publicly, and most thoroughly reined in. The 1217 Charter of the Forest is considered by historians to be Magna Carta's quiet companion, and in some ways its more practically significant twin, because it addressed the lives of far more people. Magna Carta was for the barons. The Charter of the Forest was for everyone who lived with forest law pressing on their daily existence. What remained after 1217 was still a real body of restrictions. You could not hunt the deer. You could not take green wood without a license. The forest courts still sat. The verderers still heard cases. Fines were levied and people imprisoned for serious offences. But the extreme was gone, abolished by charter, recorded in the official rolls and not subsequently restored. What would it have felt like to live at the forest's edge in, say, 1250? You would have known the forest as a particular kind of space, different from the common and the field, operating by its own rules and its own courts, somewhere out beyond the last familiar boundary. You knew which trees you could take fallen wood from and which you could not. You knew that the deer moving in the grey early morning through the underbrush, the hart, the doe, the fawn, were not available to you, however hungry the late winter weeks had been, however tempting the prospect. You knew the verderers rode. You knew the foresters walked. You knew the forest courts had careful memories. But you also knew, if you were old enough, that the worst it could do had been made less. That a charter had been sealed and proclaimed. That the world, in this one particular, had been made measurably gentler than it was. The oak boughs move in the wind, and the deer are somewhere deeper in, invisible, going about the king's business. You are not permitted to hunt them. You are permitted to look. And the forest, even hedged about with all its rules, is a place of considerable beauty on a spring morning, the light falling through the new leaves in the particular way it does in an oak wood in May, the vert providing for the venison as it has since before the law was made. The idea of a royal forest, a jurisdiction laid over a third of the country, with its own courts and its own officers and its own rules that superseded the ordinary arrangements of county and parish, seems almost impossible to picture in our world. There is no national park in the modern sense that quite captures it. A national park is a place you go and enjoy and leave with a few restrictions about camping and fires. The King's Forest was a thing that you lived inside, that pressed on your daily decisions about where your animals could graze and what dead wood you could pick up from the ground. You had to know where the forest boundary ran. Generations of families who lived at the forest's edge knew it in the same way they knew the boundaries of their own fields, by landmark, by memory, by what their parents had told them and their parents' parents before that. This stone, this old hollow ash, this particular place where the slope changes. Beyond here, the forest's law. Within, the manners. The line was unwritten but not unknown, and to cross it with the wrong intentions was to enter a different legal world with different consequences. The verderers who held the forest courts were elected in the county court, local men of some standing, known in the area, who understood the land and its uses. They were not distant royal officials parachuted in from London. They were the forest's own judges, embedded in the landscape they administered, sitting in the swain moat courts that heard presentments of offences against the vert and the venison. Their records were the forest's memory, the name of the man, the nature of the offence, the judgment, the fine paid. A name on a forest court roll was a name in a story of transgression and consequence, the same way a name on a manor court roll was a name in a story of small debts and stray animals. The forest's protected deer moved in their own rhythms, largely indifferent to the legal structure built around them. The hart fed in the morning and the evening. The hinds gathered in their groups in the clearings. The fawns were born in the deep cover of May, spotted and trembling, learning the forest by their mother's example. None of them knew about the 1217 Charter. None of them knew that the penalty for their deaths had been reduced from mutilation to a fine. They simply moved through the vert that was theirs by royal decree, watched by the foresters, noted in the records, protected by a bureaucracy that would have been unrecognizable to them and was simply the world to everyone who lived around them. You stand at the forest's edge in the morning light. The birds are active in the new leaves, and somewhere in the deeper shadow a woodpecker is working at a dead oak. There is no fence, no sign, no clear marker of the kind you would see today. There is only the knowledge, carried in your memory from childhood, confirmed by every adult in the village, of where the boundary runs. On this side, your world. On that side, his. The good news is that the deer are beautiful. The bad news is that they are not yours. The forest remains. The rules remain. The Charter has made them less harsh than they were. And the morning goes on, in the oak wood and the open field alike, the same morning that falls on the king and the commoner and the deer and the verderer's horse, indifferent to every law that human hands have made to govern the movement of animals through the trees. The bell from the parish church sounds at dusk, not a full peal, not the summoning cascade of Sunday morning, but a single measured toll, marking the turn from day to night. In the town street, the effect is almost immediate. Doors that were standing open through the afternoon are pulled shut. The last of the market traders are packing their goods into baskets and boxes, lashing down the stall covers for the night. The alehouses are settling into the quieter rhythm of the evening hours. And somewhere near the north gate, the watch is beginning its night. The word curfew has slipped from one meaning to another over the centuries without quite announcing the change. The curfew, you know, the rule that restricts movement, that means you may not be on the street after a certain hour, shares its root with a French phrase meaning cover the fire, the couvre-feu of the domestic hearth, the covering of the embers at the end of the day. But in the medieval town at nightfall, curfew means something specific to the streets, the rule of who may be abroad in the dark, under what circumstances, and with what authority waiting if they are not supposed to be there. A rule of the night itself. The Statute of Winchester, issued in 1285 under Edward I, is a careful and practical document about keeping the king's peace in English towns and along English roads. It codified and extended the system of watch and ward, the organised overnight watching of towns, gate by gate, wall by wall. In a city of any real size, 6 men were to watch at each gate from sunset to sunrise. In a borough, 4. In a smaller market town, the numbers adjusted downward, but the principle held. The gate was to be watched every night by men who knew their town and their neighbours and could identify a stranger in the dark. These were not suggestions or guidelines or best practice recommendations. They were legal obligations, and the town was answerable to the county sheriff if they were not maintained. Picture yourself as one of the watch, then, on a cold night in the late 1300s, with the town barred and settled behind you. You are one of 4 men at the north gate of a market town, tradesmen taken in turn for this duty, each serving his assigned nights through the year. You have a lantern, a billhook, and a rattle. The lantern gives you 4 feet of visibility in any direction. The billhook is a long-handled curved blade, useful both as a tool and as a convincing argument against someone who does not want to stop when asked. The rattle is the alarm. When you shake it, the harsh wooden clatter carries down the street to the next watchman, and from him to the next, and the sound is the town's signal that something is wrong, and that everyone who hears it has an obligation to respond. You will stand here through the night. All night, from the bar of the gate to the first grey light of dawn. In the cold, in the quiet, in the dark that exists beyond the small pool of your lantern's orange light. The gate has been barred behind the last honest traffic of the day. The street behind you is empty. You are at the boundary between the town and the night, which are, in the legal geography of the medieval world, almost different places. Your authority under the statute is to stop any stranger found in the streets between now and morning. Not to arrest them in any formal sense, not to charge them or deliver any formal judgment, but to detain them and hold them until the daylight. A stranger abroad at night was, by the logic of the statute, suspicious by the simple fact of being there. Honest people had their doors shut and their fires covered. Honest people were at home, in their beds, in their halls, going about the ordinary business of sleeping and keeping warm. Honest people were not walking the dark streets of a town where they were not known. If the watch recognized the face, a neighbour, a local trader, a person with an obvious and innocent reason for being abroad at this hour, they might be waved through with a nod. But an unknown face at midnight, a person no one could place, was brought to the constable and held until the morning light established their business or their identity. The night was, in a very real sense, a different jurisdiction. The day belonged to the market, the church, the open street, the 1,000 small transactions of ordinary working life. The night belonged to the watch. The darkness was absolute, with no modern equivalent. There are no streetlights burning along the curbs. There are no lit windows from upstairs, rooms full of electric bulbs. There is no ambient glow from the town on the next hill bleeding into the sky above. In that darkness, sound and shape are the only information available. The creak of a sign in the wind. The scuff of a boot on wet cobbles. A shadow at the edge of the lantern's pool that might be a man or might be a door standing open. You have the light in your hand and a few feet of visibility in any direction, and beyond that is the wall of the night. By today's standards, this is an extraordinary set of arrangements. There is no paid police service, no detective, no forensic capability, no one whose professional obligation it is to keep the peace so that yours is not. No call to make, no radio, no backup. Just 4 men and a lantern and the authority of the statute. No ambulance to call, no emergency number, no central heating to return to when the watch was done. But alongside the watch ran a second system, one that required not 4 men at a gate, but every person in the community. This was hue and cry. When a crime was committed, a theft, a robbery, a violent assault, the victim or any witness raised the alarm by crying out in the street, immediately and loudly, so that everyone within hearing knew something had gone wrong. Every person who heard the cry was legally obligated to join the pursuit. Not invited. Not encouraged if they happened to feel civic-minded. Obligated under the law to leave whatever they were doing and join the chase. The pursuit ran from ville to ville, village to village. The alarm passed along the road, extended beyond the boundaries of the original community until the offender was caught or the trail went cold. And if the criminal escaped, if the combination of the watch and the hue and cry failed to bring anyone in, the 100, the administrative division of the Shire, was collectively answerable. The 100 could be fined. Policing, in this system, was not the job of a professional body at all. It was the job of everyone who lived in the community, whose peace was the community's own, maintained by its own collective weight. The watch who kept the gate had nothing that would be recognizable today as police equipment or police training. No standardized uniform, no set procedures, no chain of command beyond the constable and the sheriff. No warrant, no formal process, no written record of every person stopped and questioned. What there was instead was the town's agreement that these 4 men, by standing here through the cold night, were doing the whole community's watching so that the whole community could sleep safely in its beds. The watch was tired so that you did not have to be. The rattle, if it came, would bring people to their windows. But until it came, the understanding was that the dark was being managed, that someone was awake on everyone's behalf, that the town was held together for one more night. The hue and cry also tells us something interesting about how the medieval world understood responsibility. When a crime was committed and the hue was raised, every person who heard it and did not respond was, in theory, failing in their legal duty. Not their civic duty, not their moral duty, but their legal duty, enforceable by fine. The distinction matters. We are accustomed to a world in which there is a police service whose job it is to respond to crime, and your job is to call them and then stay out of the way. The medieval arrangement was different in kind. The whole community was the constabulary, and everyone was on duty all the time. You think about this as you lie in your bed listening for the rattle. The night is quiet so far. The streets are empty. Somewhere out at the north gate, one of your 4 neighbours is standing by the lantern, watching the dark for whatever the dark might produce. The Statute of Winchester also addressed itself to the roads. A traveller on the King's Highway had, in theory, certain protections. The highway itself was protected ground, and ambush on the road was a serious offence. But the statute also required that the verges of the road be cleared of trees and undergrowth for a specified width on either side, 200 feet in the statute's language, so that robbers had no cover to lurk in. Policing and landscape management in one provision. The town gates barred at night, the roads cleared in daylight. The same impulse, the same understanding that safety was a condition of the physical environment as much as of the people who moved through it. The stranger detained at the gate had a specific experience that deserves a moment's attention. They were not thrown in a dungeon, not beaten, not formally charged with anything. They were held, kept until morning, when the day restored visibility and identity and the possibility of checking their story. The town constable spoke with them, established where they came from and where they were going, and made a judgment about whether their presence was legitimate. Most detentions ended with the stranger released in the morning, perhaps admonished, certainly inconvenienced, going on their way with a story about the town's overcautious watch. But the system also meant that if you were a genuine stranger with a genuine innocent purpose, a merchant on the road, a pilgrim moving between shrines, a servant travelling on his master's business, you knew to arrive before dark or to find lodging outside the walls. The gate closed at dusk. After that, your reasons for being on the street were your own business and potentially the watch's. The sensible traveller planned around the curfew the way a sensible traveller today plans around border crossings and customs hours. It was a fact of the travelling life, predictable and manageable if you knew about it. The whole arrangement requires a kind of mental adjustment from where we stand now. No phone to call, no patrol to hail, no number to ring, no app to find help with. No camera network above the street recording every face that passes. The security of the town at night rested on 4 men with lanterns, a collective obligation to respond to noise, and the understanding that honest people were in their beds. It was a system built for a world where most people knew most other people, where a stranger stood out by definition, and where the community's own weight was the primary force keeping things orderly. The bell has long since fallen silent. The street outside your shuttered window is quiet. The watchman is at his post, the lantern throwing its orange pool on the wet cobbles, 4 feet in every direction. The gate is barred. The night is in the right hands. You can let go of it now. The watch keeps the dark, so that the rest of the town can sleep. Inside now, out of the dark and the watch's cold circuit, into a craftsman's workshop in a town sometime in the 14th century. It is a large room, low-ceilinged, warm from a full day's work, smelling of wood shavings or tallow or dye, or the particular sharp smell of hot metal. Whichever craft this workshop practices, the smell of it has been in the walls long enough that the walls themselves seem to have absorbed it, the way a church absorbs the smell of incense over generations. The tools are hung on their pegs along the far wall, each in the place it has been returned to at the end of every working day. The work of the day is on the bench, set down carefully, covered with a cloth. The fire on the hearth has been built up enough to hold through the evening. And you have been in this room, under this master, for 3 years now, with 4 more yet to go before the indenture is satisfied. You entered a craft by indenture. The indenture is a legal document, a contract, and the name comes from the particular method of its making. 2 copies of the agreement were written on a single sheet of vellum, then cut apart along a jagged or indented edge. An irregular serrated cut that was unique to this particular sheet on this particular day, so that the 2 pieces, when held together later, would prove each other genuine because no forgery could replicate the exact profile of a particular cutting. Your copy and the master's copy. The same words, the same obligations, the same edge, and no others in the world. What did you promise? 7 years, or something near it. The precise term varied considerably by trade and by the negotiation between the parents who were placing the boy and the master who was taking him in. A cook's apprentice might serve 2 years, a goldsmith might serve 10, the average across most crafts settling somewhere around 7. Long enough that the master had time to train the apprentice properly and receive real productive work in return. Long enough that the apprentice would learn the craft sufficiently that his years of training had not been wasted on a shallow foundation. In exchange for those 7 years of service, you received bed and board under the master's roof, clothing appropriate to an apprentice of the household, and instruction in the mystery of the trade. That word, mystery, arriving in English from the French métier, meaning craft or profession, carrying with it the sense of something held and transmitted and not lightly given away, the body of knowledge, and skill and technique that the trade claimed as its own province. A 1420 example of a standard indenture sets out the obligations on both sides, with a precision that leaves very little to chance. You were to serve faithfully and do nothing that dishonoured the household or the trade. Marriage during the term was forbidden. It brought family obligations that would divide your loyalty and your attention from the master's business, and the master had invested too much in your training to share that investment with a new family you had started. Frequenting taverns on your own account was barred. Evenings spent in the alehouses left you slow and blurry in the morning when the work required you to be sharp. Gambling was barred. Trading on your own account was barred. Buying and selling in the marketplace, exercising the skills of the craft for your own benefit, before those skills were properly yours to exercise. You were to keep the master's secrets, the particular techniques, the recipes, the methods, the knowledge that made this workshop what it was and different from the one down the street. The master, for his part, was to teach you the craft properly, not to hold back the harder techniques or the deeper knowledge in order to keep you dependent longer. He was to feed you, clothe you, house you, and treat you as someone in his household and under his care. The relationship was not always easy, not always warm, not always without friction between a man who owned the space and a boy who was in it by contract. But it was regulated. The guild watched over it. If the master failed his obligations, the apprentice had recourse, and the guild had an interest in making sure the training was real. When the 7 years were done, you did not immediately become a master yourself. You became a journeyman, a qualified craftsman, a man who had completed his formation, who knew the trade well enough to work without supervision, but who worked for wages by the day rather than running his own establishment. The word comes from the French journée, a day's work, paid by the day. You were neither master nor apprentice, but something in between, a skilled worker who needed capital and reputation and the guild's approval before he could take the next step. Some journeymen travelled, moving from town to town and workshop to workshop, hiring their skills where there was work and the terms were reasonable, building a reputation across a wider geography. Some settled in one town and worked for years under the same master without advancing, because setting up one's own establishment required money that some never accumulated, connections that some never developed, and a piece of work impressive enough to satisfy the guild's wardens. To become a master, in the guilds where the system was most developed, you needed to produce a masterpiece, a piece of work judged by the guild's wardens as demonstrating full competence in the craft, the kind of work that warranted the authority to take on your own apprentices and train them and take responsibility for what came out of your workshop. This practice is most clearly documented in the later medieval period and on the continent, more specifically codified in some trades than others. But the principle, that entry to the rank of master required a demonstration of skill judged by those who already held that rank, was part of the guild logic across the later Middle Ages. Because the guild was the trade's entire world in almost every sense that mattered practically. It was the workplace. Its ordinances governed what you could make, how you could make it, how many hours you worked and by what light, what prices you could charge, how many apprentices you were permitted to take on at any one time. It was the enforcement body. The guild had searchers whose job was to inspect members' goods at the point of sale or in the workshop and bring before the guild court any work that was shoddy, underweight, made from inferior materials, or priced in a way that undercut the agreements the guild maintained for the benefit of all its members. A fine for shoddy work was not merely financial. It was a public mark against your name in the guild records, something your competitors knew and your customers might hear. The guild was also the union. A guild in good health looked after its sick members, contributed to the funerals of those who died in poverty, kept something back for the widows and children of members who left their families without means. It was the social world, the guild feast on the feast of the patron saint, the guild procession through the town in the livery colours, the shared identity of belonging to a particular craft in a particular place. These were the occasions that marked the year and situated you in the town's life. And it was the morality police. Guild ordinances reached into how you treated your apprentices, how you dealt with your journeymen, whether you attempted to poach trained workers from a colleague or to lure an apprentice away mid-term with a better offer. By today's standards, there is no direct equivalent. No institution combines a licensing board, a union, an employment agency, a social welfare fund, and a trade association in one entity, with the same person as member of all of them simultaneously. No off-the-shelf career path, no application form, no interview, no online test of your skills, and definitely no WI-FI to research whether this trade was a good choice. You entered through the 7-year door, lived in the master's house, learned the craft through the hands of someone who already held it, and came out the other side either a journeyman working toward the next step or a man who had found his permanent place somewhere in the middle of the ladder. The guild feast deserves a moment of its own, because it was one of the great pleasures of the guild world, the occasion that balanced all the obligations with a shared celebration. Once a year, on the feast day of the patron saint of the trade, St. Crispin for shoemakers, St. Eloi for metalworkers, St. Luke for painters, the members of the guild gathered in their hall or in a hired tavern in their livery colours, and ate together and drank together, and conducted the guild's ceremonial business in a spirit of collective belonging. New members were admitted. Accounts were heard. The year's fines and the year's charity were tallied. And then the evening opened into something less formal, the feast that was simply the pleasure of belonging to a craft and a community in a particular town at a particular time. There was no spreadsheet tracking the guild's accounts, no email chain coordinating the feast, no central heating in the guild hall, and definitely no HR department to process the complaints. The guild's business was conducted face to face, in the hall, by men who knew each other well enough to have an opinion about each other's work and a vote in each other's futures. By today's standards, this is a densely bound professional world. You cannot simply set up a competing shop and undercut your neighbours on price. You cannot hire labour outside the guild, cannot source materials through channels the guild has not approved, cannot advertise your services as better than your colleagues in ways that would be considered poaching rather than competition. The guild's rules covered all of this, and the guild's searchers watched for violations. What you gained in return was the certainty that your competitors were bound by the same rules, that the market was not a race to the bottom but a managed terrain in which quality and fair dealing were enforced from above. The mystery of the craft, that word again, the thing passed from master to apprentice in the workshop, the body of knowledge that made the trade, was also the guild's primary asset. Keep it. Guard it. Teach it only to those who had entered properly and served fully. The guild's authority rested on the quality of what its members produced, and the quality of what its members produced rested on the training, which rested on the mystery, which was why you were not to tell anyone outside the workshop what you had learned inside it. The trade's secret was the trade's value. You set down your tools as the evening light fails, and the rules about working by artificial light make continued work impractical. Too much fire risk, too much chance of work done poorly in inadequate light reflecting badly on the workshop and the trade. The tools go back on their pegs. The work on the bench is covered. The fire is checked one more time. 3 years of your 7 are done. The mystery is opening, slowly, like a heavy door that swings inward by degrees. A little further each month, each completed task, each technique absorbed into the hands so that it stops requiring thought. 7 years is a long time when you are young. It is less long when you understand what waits at the end of it. something that cannot be taken from you, that lives in the muscles of your hands as much as in your memory. The trade. Entered by a 7-year door. Yours, eventually, for the rest of your working life. Come now to a parish church in a market town on a Sunday morning in the 1300s, a little before the main service begins. The congregation is settling in, as it does every Sunday, finding the familiar spots on the benches, the familiar neighbours to either side, the familiar smell of candle wax and old stone, and the breath of a crowd assembled in a stone space. But there is a particular quality of attention in the room today, a slight alertness beyond the usual Sunday readiness, as the priest moves to the front of the nave and begins to read the banns. The banns are a public announcement. They name 2 specific people, a man and a woman of this parish or of a neighbouring parish, and they declare that these 2 people intend to marry. They are read on 3 successive Sundays, not once, not twice, but 3 separate times over 3 separate weeks. And the reading has a purpose that goes considerably beyond mere formality. It is an open invitation to anyone in the congregation who knows of a legitimate reason that this marriage cannot lawfully take place to say so, clearly, before witnesses, before the moment when stopping it becomes impossible. A prior promise of marriage given to a third party, made in the garden or in private, that has never been formally released. A degree of kinship that canon law considers too close. Blood relationship, or relationship by marriage, or the spiritual kinship created by being godparent to the same child. Any legal impediment at all. 3 Sundays give 3 opportunities for such a reason to come forward, in a community where people know each other's histories and families and old entanglements. This system was established by the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, one of the great reforming councils of the medieval church, which addressed marriage law along with many other questions of doctrine and practice. Before the banns became the standard requirement, clandestine marriages were a persistent and considerable problem in the church's pastoral life. 2 people exchanging vows in private, in a garden, in a doorway, in a field with only the birds as witnesses, could create a marriage that was canonically valid. When one of them later claimed no such thing had happened, or attempted to marry someone else, the dispute that followed was frequently impossible to resolve cleanly, and the damage to individuals and communities was real. The banns were the church's response. Make the intention public, give the community 3 weeks in which any legitimate bar might surface, and reduce the space for the kind of confusion and scandal that clandestine vows created. The forbidden degrees of kinship had also been reformed by the same council. Before 1215, canon law extended the prohibition to the 7th degree of consanguinity. Anyone sharing a common ancestor within 6 generations was considered too closely related to marry. In a small medieval village where the same families had occupied the same cluster of houses for generations, where great-grandparents had been neighbours, finding a spouse who was unimpeachably clear of the 7th degree could be a genuine difficulty. The council reduced the bar to 4 degrees of blood relationship, supplemented by parallel rules about affinity. The bar on marrying a relative of a former spouse, and the spiritual kinship created by godparenthood. 4 degrees is still a meaningful restriction in a small community. But it is a navigable one, as 7 simply was not. here is the part of medieval marriage law that genuinely surprises people when they first encounter it squarely. The Church's own theology held that a marriage was made valid not by any ceremony but by the freely given present tense consent of the two parties to each other. Present tense words of consent. I take you as my wife, I take you as my husband. Exchanged directly between the two people, even without a priest present, even without any witnesses, even outside any church building, created a binding marriage. In a barn, in a garden, alone in a field at noon. Anywhere, provided the words were genuinely meant and genuinely spoken. This is precisely why the Church worked so hard to establish and enforce the bans and the church door ceremony, because if a private exchange of words was the legally decisive moment, private exchanges would keep happening and the formal rite would have no grip on the process. The bans and the church door ceremony were the Church's effort to move the decisive moment into public space, witnessed space, space where the community was present and could remember what had been said and what had been promised. The ceremony itself took place at the church door, in the porch, or at the entrance to the nave, rather than at the altar within. The vows were exchanged in the open air, with the parish as witness. The ring was given at the door. The dower, the property the husband designated for his wife's maintenance in widowhood, was named publicly there, before witnesses who could later be called to confirm what had been promised. And then the couple and the priest and the witnesses moved inside for the nuptial mass, the blessing and prayers that completed the ceremony and committed the new household to God's keeping. Measured against modern expectations, the wedding's documentation seems startlingly light. No registry office, no certificate, no record signed in triplicate and filed somewhere official. No marriage license applied for and granted in advance. No formal paperwork of any kind generated by the ceremony itself. The wedding's only formal public record was a name read aloud in church on 3 successive Sundays, and the witnesses who had been present at the door to hear the vows and see the ring given. And yet this was considered, canonically, legally, in the church's courts and in the secular courts that dealt with inheritance and property, entirely sufficient. The community had heard. The priest had heard. 3 Sundays had passed without an objection. The vows had been spoken at the door. The marriage was real. The 3 Sundays of bans could feel like an exposed weight to a young couple eager to move forward. 3 weeks of sitting in the church while their intentions were publicly known. 3 weeks of being, in some sense, the subject of the community's quiet attention and judgment. Anyone who wanted to stop this could do so now. The old neighbour with the long memory. The cousin who had his own opinions about the match. 3 weeks of public availability to objection. But there is another way to hold it. The community was being asked to care about this marriage, to think carefully whether they knew anything that stood in the way. When 3 Sundays passed and no impediment was raised, that silence was a kind of communal approval, as real as the spoken vows that followed. We have heard the names. We know nothing against it. Let them marry at the door. The ring itself carried a weight of meaning that no modern wedding ring quite matches, not because the object was more beautiful. It might be a plain band of silver or even a ring of brass, but because of where it was given and what it meant when it was placed. Given at the church door, in front of witnesses, as the dower was being named, the ring was simultaneously a token of affection, a legal instrument, and a public declaration. The woman received it in full view of everyone who had come to watch. No small private ceremony, no ring box produced at a restaurant table. The giving of the ring was, in the most literal sense, a public act, witnessed and remembered. Scholars of medieval marriage law are at pains to point out how flexible and complicated the system was in practice, how the definition of consent could be disputed, how the distinction between present tense words "I take you" and future tense words "I will take you" created different legal consequences, how the church courts were kept busy adjudicating disputed marriages for centuries. The rules were real and they mattered, but the application of those rules to actual human lives, with all their complications and contradictions, was never simple. And yet the aspiration behind the bans was a genuine one. The church wanted marriages to be known, acknowledged, and witnessed. It wanted the community to have the opportunity to raise legitimate objections before the vows were spoken. It wanted the network of obligation and knowledge that a small community provided to serve as a check on the private impulse to do whatever seemed convenient. 3 Sundays. 3 chances. 3 weeks in which anyone who knew anything was invited to say so. The vows exchanged at the church door were, in the church's understanding, the most binding words a person could speak. Not the most solemn. The ordeal's oath might claim that, but the most life-shaping, the words that determined who you would live with, whose household you would share, whose children you would raise, whose bed you would sleep in. The words were simple, present tense, direct. I take you. No qualification, no conditions, no escape clause. You said it, with the whole village watching, and the world changed. No registry, no certificate, no paperwork to lose. Just a name read aloud 3 Sundays in a row, a ring given at a door, and the parish as witness. Consider what the wedding's geography says about the world that produced it. The vows happen at the door, neither fully inside the sacred space nor fully outside in the ordinary world, but on the threshold. The church's interior, with its altar and its candles and its accumulated weight of liturgical meaning, was reserved for the Mass that followed. The door was the space of law and contract, of the ring and the dower and the public declaration. The marriage was made at the threshold, on the line between the 2 worlds. Then you entered the sacred space together, already married. The forbidden degrees also deserve a fuller pause, because they shaped who could marry whom in ways that would seem extraordinary today. You could not marry within 4 degrees of blood, meaning your great-great-grandparent was the boundary. Anyone sharing a common ancestor closer than that was barred. You could not marry someone your previous spouse had been closely related to. The affinity bar, which meant that if your first wife's sister was also close family, she was barred too. And the spiritual kinship rules meant that the web of godparenthood, which spread through the whole parish with every baptism and every confirmation, created a further set of relationships within which marriage was forbidden. In a small parish where families had been marrying for generations and where godparenthood connected houses that blood did not, the landscape of who was technically available to marry could become genuinely complicated. The church courts that handled marriage disputes were kept busy in part by exactly this complexity, by cases where two people had exchanged vows and then discovered, or been informed by an interested party, that they were within the forbidden degrees. The bans were meant to surface these problems before the vows were spoken. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they did not, and the court had the resulting complexity to manage. There is a kind of wry comfort in this, if you are feeling that the rules of medieval marriage were impossibly demanding. The Church's answer to the complexity it had created, the multiplying degrees, the affinity rules, the spiritual kinship bars, was the dispensation. If you were too closely related by any of these measures but had compelling reasons for the marriage to proceed anyway, political alliances, consolidated land holdings, simple love, you could apply to the bishop, or in serious cases to Rome, for a dispensation releasing you from the specific bar. The dispensation cost money, as most medieval administrative solutions did. But it existed. The rules were real. They were also navigable by the sufficiently motivated and the sufficiently funded. No online form for the dispensation, no standard processing time, no confirmation email, and definitely no same-day service. Just a petition to the bishop, a fee, a wait, and then either the answer came or it did not, and you adjusted your plans accordingly. The priest is ready. The village is gathered at the churchyard gate. The rule has been followed 3 Sundays running. The names are known. The impediments have not been raised. The vows are about to be spoken in public, with witnesses who will remember. A name read aloud 3 Sundays in a row, the simplest paperwork in the world, and the only kind this marriage has ever needed. Move now away from the church, away from the market, away from the court rolls and the guild ordinances and the parchment statutes, out into the village street on a winter evening. Somewhere in this street, something is about to happen that has no legal basis, no official sanction, no written rule behind it. And yet, it is one of the most effective and memorable forms of social enforcement that the medieval world possessed. A widower in the village has remarried within a few weeks of his first wife's death. The new wife is considerably younger, young enough that the village considers the match ill-suited, rushed, disrespectful to the memory of the woman buried not 3 weeks since in the churchyard. Or perhaps the situation is different. A widow who has found a new husband with a speed that the community considers indecorous when her first husband's grave is still fresh. Or perhaps neither of these exactly, but rather a household where the wife is known to govern the husband in ways that violate the village's expected order of things, where the man is considered led about and overruled in his own house in ways that the community has noticed and formed opinions about. Whatever the precise trigger, the village has reached a judgment. Not in a court, not before a constable or a bailiff or a bishop's official, not with any process of evidence or formal decision-making. In the collective moral consciousness of people who have lived in the same cluster of houses for generations, who hold strong views about how certain things should be done, and who are about to make those views very loud indeed. And so the Charivari begins. The word is French, and the custom is older than the word and older than most of its documentation. In the south of England, the practice might be called a skimmington. In the north, stang riding. In different places, different names for the same essential thing. The records that describe it most fully tend to come from the later medieval and the early modern periods, because informal practices are documented most richly when people are writing about them in some detail. But the medieval roots are attested, the medieval examples are real, and the core pattern is consistent across the centuries of its life. What happens, in its basic shape, is this. A crowd assembles outside the offending household, after dark or in the early evening, armed with the most noise-making implements that can be quickly gathered from the kitchens and barns and workshops of the neighbourhood. Pots beaten with wooden ladles. Pans clashed together at full force. Horns blown. Whistles. Anything that produces sound that is the deliberate, pointed opposite of music. A chaotic, clashing, unmerry serenade delivered to a house whose occupants are expected to hear it and understand perfectly what is being communicated by the people outside. Sometimes the crowd carries an effigy, a rough figure of straw or rags, built to represent the household's perceived offence in visible, theatrical form. The figure might be carried on a pole through the street, subjected to mock trial, made to enact whatever inversion the crowd is responding to. The skimmington ladle was a favourite prop for the scenario of the wife who governs the husband. A woman figure carrying it, making the gesture of striking, playing out the world upside down for the crowd's entertainment and the household's acute discomfort. The symbolism made the complaint visible, gave the abstract social judgment a face that everyone could see and respond to. It sounds alarming. At close range, in a house whose timber walls were not designed to stop sound, it would have been. But it is important to understand what the Charivari was and what it was not. It was not a riot. It was not a beating. The Charivari was, in its essential character, public embarrassment. The sharp and concentrated edge of communal laughter and communal disapproval turned on a household that had breached the unwritten rules. The couple or the household inside was being noticed, mocked, serenaded with noise that said as plainly as any statute, "We see what you have done, we disapprove, and we are making sure you know it." The pressure was psychological and social. The mechanism was shame. The instrument was noise. The goal was not punishment in any lasting physical sense, but correction. A loud, emphatic, theatrical nudge back toward the expected way of doing things, delivered by the community to one of its own. The unwritten rules that the Charivari enforced had no charter, no council that had agreed them, no clerk who had written them down on a roll. They were the accumulated moral grammar of the village, what everyone knew to be right and wrong in the conduct of a marriage, a remarriage, a household, a relationship between husband and wife. This grammar was passed down without being written, enforced without being formally adjudicated, and understood without being taught in any formal setting. You absorbed it the way you absorbed everything about the place where you were born, through the air, through the thousand small signals of approval and disapproval that a close community generates and reads continuously, through watching how people responded to one another across years of close proximity. By today's standards, there is something both comic and slightly bracing about the Charivari. We have social pressure, we have the disapproving glance, we have gossip, we have the quiet withdrawal of warmth that can follow behavior the community considers wrong. But we keep these things private or express them through indirect channels. The Charivari was none of those things. It was public, collective, theatrical, and very loud. The community gathered in the street and made its opinion not merely known but performed, enacted for everyone to witness, neighbours and bystanders and the offenders inside the house simultaneously. And the performance usually worked. The household that found itself targeted by a Charivari understood what was expected. Some gesture of acknowledgement, some offering. Buy the crowd a drink, show that you have heard and taken the message, make some adjustment to the behaviour that had brought them to your door. Once the gesture was made, or once the crowd's energy had run its natural course, the noise stopped and the street went quiet. The village had corrected itself without a constable, without a court roll, without anyone writing anything down. The pots have stopped banging. The street is quiet. The crowd has dispersed back to their houses and their fires. The energy of the evening dissipated, the neighbourhood settling back into its ordinary rhythms. Inside the house, the fire still burns, and the people inside are only now beginning to recover from a very long and very loud evening. The village has said its piece. Everything, more or less, is back in its appointed place. The Charivari also worked because everyone understood it as a finite thing, not an indefinite persecution. It had a beginning, a middle, and an expected end. The gesture of acknowledgement from the offending household, and then the crowd dispersed, and the matter was, if not forgotten, at least set aside. The village had expressed its disapproval. Having done so, it was entitled to resume normal relations. The grudge that outlasted the noise was considered bad form on the crowd's part as much as on the household's. The correct emotional arc was a vigorous serenade, an acknowledgement, and then the resumption of neighbourliness. Not forgiveness exactly, but a managed return to the daily fabric of communal life. Some scholars read the Charivari as the community doing something genuinely important, policing a social boundary that the formal law could not reach. Marriage, particularly the remarriage of widows and widowers, had implications for the inheritance of property and the care of children and the economic arrangements of the extended family. A hasty remarriage might benefit the new couple and harm the children of the first marriage. A mismatched marriage might create a disorderly household that imposed costs on the neighbourhood. The community had, in a real sense, a stake in these decisions, and the Charivari was its way of making that stake felt. The cucking stool in the pond, the Charivari in the street, the village's collective tongue. These were the enforcement mechanisms that no parliament had created and no court had formalised. They were older than the courts, older than the statutes, older than almost everything else in the episode. They were what people did, what people had always done, when the formal machinery of law could not reach the thing that needed addressing. The village as its own judge. The noise as its own verdict. The silence afterward as its own kind of acquittal. The cucking stool was the medieval shaming device that the court could actually order. A chair on a long pole that could be dipped in the pond or the river, used against persistent scolds and dishonest traders, recorded in town bylaws from the 13th and 14th centuries. This was the formal legal version of the Charavari's logic. The same principle of public embarrassment, the same appeal to the community's gaze, but administered by a court officer with a written order behind it. The scold's bridle you might have heard of is a different matter, not medieval in its first English uses. The genuinely medieval punishment was the ducking stool and the public shame of the market. Both the formal and the informal versions operated on the same understanding, that community embarrassment was a real and effective force, that the eyes of the village were a kind of authority. The Charavari and the cucking stool together tell us something about the moral texture of medieval village life. Privacy, in the modern sense, the right to conduct your household affairs without comment from the neighbours, was not a value that medieval village life recognised or protected. You lived in a cluster of houses separated by thin walls and closed gardens, with shared wells and shared common and shared church. And the expectation was that the community had an interest in how you managed your household, your marriage, your relationships. Not a nosy interest, not a prurient one, but a genuine communal stake. A badly managed household was a problem that spilled over into the street, into the common, into the peace of the neighbourhood. There is something that feels strange about this from the outside. By today's standards, what happened in your house was your business, and the idea that your neighbours might gather with pots in the street to express their views about your marriage is more alarming than comforting. No privacy policy here, no individual right to be left alone, no quiet recourse to a therapist, and definitely no unlisted phone number. The village was the village, and you were in it, and the village had opinions. And yet, holding it gently, there is also something to be said for a world in which the community cared enough about its members to respond. Noisily, theatrically, but not violently, when it thought something had gone wrong. The Charavari was not indifference. It was the opposite of indifference. It was the village saying, "We are paying attention to you, and we have views about how things should be done, and we are going to make those views known." Whether you welcomed that attention or not depended a great deal on who you were and what you had done. What the Charavari tells us about medieval village life is that the formal law was never the only mechanism by which a community kept itself in order. Running alongside and beneath all the written rules was this older, unwritten, entirely human system of collective observation and collective response. Your neighbours watched you. They formed opinions about what you did. They had views about how things should be done, and those views were shared and confirmed and sharpened by the closeness of village life. And if you strayed far enough from the expected path, they let you know about it in a manner that was very difficult to ignore and impossible to pretend away. Come inside now, to a hall at dinner somewhere in the England of the 1300s or early 1400s. The trestle tables are set out, the benches arranged in their accustomed places, the fire sending warmth across the rushes on the floor and light up the curve of the ceiling. The household is gathering for the main meal of the day, finding its usual spots with the ease of long habit. The same faces in roughly the same places they always occupy, which is itself an expression of the hierarchy of the house, legible to everyone present without needing to be stated. You are settling onto a bench beside someone you know well, a fellow member of the household of similar rank, because the two of you are going to share a trencher. Eating together in a medieval hall was not simply being in the same room as other people who were also eating. It was a structured, rule-governed activity in which the act of sharing a bowl with another person required a set of explicit agreements about behavior, agreed by convention, drilled in from childhood, expected by everyone present. The structure had a name: the mess. A mess was a group of 2 to 4 people who shared a single trencher. A thick disk of stale bread, perhaps 2 days old, dense enough to absorb liquid without collapsing, and often a single cup. What you ate came from the same serving vessel, placed on the shared surface between you. What you drank came from the same cup, passed between you and your neighbour. The proximity was intimate by any standard, and the rules existed precisely because of that intimacy. The rules come down to us through a genre of medieval writing known as the courtesy books, or books of nurture. These were practical manuals of table behaviour, and of general conduct appropriate to someone serving in or living in a substantial household, written in verse so that they could be memorized by young people who were unlikely to have a book to consult in the moment they needed guidance. A rhymed inventory of obligations drilled into pages and apprentices and the children of any household that cared about its standing in the local world. The genre runs from the 13th century into the 15th and beyond, and the specific named texts cluster toward the later end of the medieval period. The Boke of Courtesier, John Russell's Boke of Nurture, Caxton's printed courtesy texts. These are 15th century documents, products of a moment when there was a ready printing press and an audience for such things. But the rules themselves, the actual practical content of what was expected at table, are older than the books. The books codified practice that had been developing in English households for a long time, practice that everyone in a well-run establishment already knew. What did the rules say? You did not reach across the shared trencher to take from your neighbour's side. You did not take the best and largest piece of whatever had been served when offering first to the person next to you was the clear expectation. You did not return a bone to the serving dish after you had worked the meat from it. You did not dip a piece of bread back into the shared sauce or broth after you had bitten from it. You did not wipe your hands on the tablecloth, which was meant for presentation, and which leaving greasy was an insult to the household's labour and expense. You did not blow your nose on the napkin so as to make it unfit for the next person who needed it. You washed your hands before sitting down, and you washed them again after the meal was done, because the shared bowl was touched by the hands of everyone who ate from it. You did not speak with your mouth full, not for abstract reasons of decorum, but because you were sharing a surface with someone else, and your full mouth at close quarters was their problem as much as yours. You did not produce eating sounds that could be heard distinctly by your neighbour, because your neighbour had to sit through the entire meal with you. These are not, taken individually, rules that would surprise you. Most of them survive in some form in the table expectations of today, the basic courtesies of a shared meal. What is so different is the context in which they had to operate. By today's standards, you eat from your own plate with your own fork and knife and spoon, and your primary obligation to the people around you is to be reasonable company and not to eat food off their plate. There is no sharing of surfaces, no sharing of cups, no spatial arrangement that places your food in direct contact with your neighbour's food. Here, you are sharing the same bread plate with another person. You are sharing the same cup. Your food is their food, in the sense that it arrives on the same surface and is taken from the same vessel. The line between what is yours and what is theirs runs through the middle of the trencher, requires constant implicit negotiation, and is maintained entirely by the courtesy rules that everyone at this bench has known since childhood. The rules of the shared bowl were not niceties or social decoration. They were the practical machinery of eating communally without making the experience unpleasant for everyone involved. Manners, in this context, are not a sign of refinement. They are what makes the meal function. But beneath the rules of behaviour ran a more fundamental principle, one that organised everything from where you sat to when you were served to what quality of food arrived at your portion of the table. Rank. The hall was organised around the hierarchy of the household, and that hierarchy expressed itself continuously throughout the meal without needing to be announced. Who washed their hands at the basin first was determined by rank. Who sat closest to the head of the household was determined by rank. Who was served first from the dishes coming out of the kitchen was determined by rank. Who received the better cuts of meat and the whiter bread, white bread being made from flour more finely sifted, which meant that more of the grain was discarded, which meant it cost more, which meant it was served to those at the upper end of the table. All of it flowed from the social order, which was itself a rule, unwritten but as present in the room as anything the courtesy books had ever said. The courtesy books themselves deserve a closer look, because the form they took was not accidental. They were written in verse, short rhyming couplets and stanzas, the kind of construction that lodges in the memory without effort and can be retrieved in the moment it is needed without having to look anything up. A young page in a great house had no book to consult at the dinner table. He had his memory, and the rhymes lived there, filed in the back of the mind alongside the prayers he had been set to learn, and the liturgical calendar he was expected to know. The verse was the storage medium. Wipe not thy mouth with thy hand, the tablecloth use at meal, or some equivalent of that instruction, set in a 4-beat line that repeated itself easily when you were 12 and nervous and carrying a platter you were not entirely sure you would not drop. The books drilled the rules in because drilling was the only reliable way to make the rules available at the moment they were needed. Not in the study, but in the hall, in the rush of a busy dinner, with the master's eye on you and the guests already seated. The meal itself had a shape in time that was as structured as anything written in the courtesy books. It began with the hand-washing, the ewer brought around in order of rank, the guest of highest station first, the water poured over hands held above the basin while a cloth was ready for drying. To reach your hands to the basin before your superior had washed was a mild but noticed offence, the kind that went straight into the informal record kept by everyone who had observed it. Then the seating, which was not the gathering of people wherever there happened to be a space, but a managed arrangement. The high table at the head of the hall, the side tables extending down, the benches filling in rank order, the whole room settling into its hierarchy like a liquid finding its level. Then the grace, brief but necessary, a formal recognition that the meal was given and not simply obtained. Then the dishes coming up from the kitchen, carried on boards through the screens passage and into the hall, the scent of the food arriving before the food itself. And throughout all of it, the quiet, continuous performance of the rules. No grabbing, no reaching across, no taking the best piece first. The whole room enacting, simultaneously, the code of conduct that made eating together possible and made it mean something beyond the simple satisfaction of hunger. The books of nurture addressed serving as well as eating. They told a young page how to stand when carrying dishes, how to hold the cup, how to carry the heavy platter with a cloth over his arm so that the dish would not burn his hands and the cloth would not mark the table. They told him how to respond if a guest of rank asked for something. They told him how to conduct himself so that the household's master would think well of him. Manners, in this world, were a signal of competence and upbringing that every observer at the table was reading and evaluating as naturally as they were reading the rank of the seating. A young man who ate correctly at a great household's table, who offered the better portion to his neighbour, kept his hands clean, his mouth closed, his movements quiet, was a young man who had been brought up well and could be trusted in proximity to people who mattered. The shared meal was, among other things, a continuous performance and a continuous audition. You eat your portion of the evening's mess without transgression, without reaching across, without double dipping, without wiping anything on the cloth. You give the better piece to the person beside you. The ewer comes around and you wash your hands in the basin. The fire sends its warmth across the hall. The meal is proceeding with the quiet, well-practiced competence of a community that knows exactly what it owes to each other at table. There is something satisfying in that. The sense that every person in this room is meeting an obligation they have known since childhood, without effort, without thought, because it has long since become the texture of eating itself. Rank at table was also expressed through the serving itself. The lord or the master of the house was served first. The food reached them while it was at its hottest and its best. By the time the same dish had been carried down the table to the lower end, it was cooler and the portion was smaller. This was not an accident or an oversight. It was the intended structure of the meal, the physical enactment of hierarchy in food and temperature and timing. You could read the social order of the household, if you watched carefully enough, in the precise sequence of service and the direction of the platters. The hall's acoustic life also mattered. A great hall was not a quiet space. A dozen people eating together produced conversation, the scraping of benches, the sound of cups on boards, the movement of servants. The courtesy books addressed this too. A well-run hall had a proper level of decorum, voices at a reasonable register, nothing that violated the dignity of the shared space. Music might be played. a harper in the corner, or a singing boy doing his apprenticeship in a different kind of mystery. The meal was a performance as much as a feeding, and the rules governed the performance from beginning to end. By today's standards, even a formal dinner party does not quite capture this. No tasting menu mapped against the humoral order of foods. No individual plates arriving from the kitchen in the sequence the theory of digestion required. No shared trencher, no shared cup, no watching whether the person beside you has taken the better portion. Your food is your own, your plate is your own, and the rules of the shared bowl are a curiosity rather than a necessity. The meal as a social instrument, as the place where rank was demonstrated, where courtesy was performed, where the young were trained and the hierarchy was confirmed, has not entirely disappeared. But the specific density of rules that the courtesy books encoded, the sheer detail of what was expected at a shared trencher in a medieval hall, belongs to a world where the meal was doing many more things at once than satisfying hunger. The hall settles as the meal ends. The tables will be cleared, the trestles taken apart, the rushes rearranged. For now, the warmth and the low voices and the firelight. The shared bowl has been shared correctly. The rules of the mess have been observed. The meal has been, in its small communal and thoroughly rule-governed way, a success. Consider a question, not a small question, not a question of whether the penny loaf was the right weight or whether the apprentice kept the guild's terms. A real question, a question of guilt or innocence, a question on which a man's standing and future might depend permanently. How does a medieval court decide what is true? The answer depends on when you ask and what kind of court you mean. And the history of how that answer changed over the medieval period is one of the strangest and most quietly consequential stories in the long story of how human communities have organized their knowledge of each other and their attempts to do justice among themselves. Before the year 1215, one established method for deciding a contested case was trial by ordeal. The ordeal was not a punishment visited on those already found guilty. It was the mechanism by which guilt or innocence was established in the first place. God, in the theology that underlay the system, was the only perfectly reliable judge. Human witnesses might lie. Human memory was partial and fallible. Human testimony was always shaped by interest and perspective. But God knew. God had been present at every moment of every act. And the ordeal was the mechanism by which God's judgment could be made legible in the physical world, translated into an outcome that a court could read and act upon. The most common forms in England were the ordeal by hot iron and the ordeal by cold water. In the ordeal by hot iron, the accused carried a bar of iron that had been heated until it glowed. The weight and length calibrated to the seriousness of the charge against them, 9 paces across the church floor. The hand was then bandaged by the priest. 3 days later the bandage was removed and the wound inspected by the court. If it was healing cleanly, the verdict was innocent. If the wound had festered, the verdict was guilty. In the ordeal by cold water, the accused was bound and lowered by a rope into a body of water that the priest had blessed. If the person sank, if the water accepted them, drew them down, the verdict was innocent. If they floated, if the water rejected them, would not receive them, the verdict was guilty. This is narrated as the historical record asks us to narrate it, as a belief about how truth was found, not as a deliberate spectacle of cruelty. The people who used the ordeal were not engaging in deliberate barbarism. They believed, within the framework of their understanding of God and the world, that God would intervene to make the truth visible in the outcome of the procedure. The priest blessed the water or the iron because the blessing was theologically essential. Without it, hot iron was just metal and water was just water. The blessing was what made the ordeal an ordeal in the proper sense, an appeal to divine arbitration, a formal request that God act as the judge the human court could not confidently be. Running alongside the ordeal, and in many circumstances preferred to it, was compurgation, also called the wager of law or the oath with oath helpers. In compurgation, an accused person was required not to prove innocence through evidence or eyewitness testimony, but to swear an oath of their own innocence and to produce a specified number of people, often 12, who would swear alongside them, not to the facts of what had happened, not to having witnessed anything relevant, but to the character and trustworthiness of the accused. The oath helpers vouched not for events, but for the person. They were saying, in effect, I know this man. I have watched him keep his word and meet his obligations across years of common life, and I believe his oath is worth the swearing. Or they were declining to say it, which was itself evidence. The logic here is genuinely different from anything now practiced in law. Truth, in this system, was not entirely separable from reputation. If your community, the people who had watched you across years, who knew how you kept your promises and how you treated your neighbours, if those people were willing to swear on their own souls that your word could be credited, then your oath of innocence carried weight proportional to their willingness. And if you could not find 12 people willing to stand in court and commit their own standing to yours, that failure was itself information about who you were in your community and how you had lived in it. In a small community where everyone does know everyone, where reputation is a real and maintained thing, built across years of visible behavior, the system had a coherence that it loses when you try to transplant it into a larger or more anonymous context. Reputation and truth were not entirely separate things in a world where your neighbours had been watching you for decades. Consider what compurgation actually looked like in practice, in a manor court or a church court on a winter morning. The accused stood before the court and swore, hand on the Gospels, that he had not done the thing he was accused of. Then, one by one, his oath helpers came forward to swear their supporting oath, each man placing his hand on the book and affirming that he believed the accused's word. The formula was precise and had to be spoken correctly. A stumble in the wording, a hesitation in the delivery, could invalidate the oath and the case. And if the required number of oath helpers could not be assembled, if men whom the accused had approached declined to come forward, or if too few were willing to put their own standing on the line in his support, then the failure to purge was itself a kind of verdict. Not a verdict of guilty, exactly, but a verdict of unworthiness, a finding that the community, consulted through the mechanism of the oath, was not willing to stake its own reputation on this man's word. The community had spoken through its silence, It had declined to support him. And that declination carried its own weight in the court's deliberations. The oath was also the currency of ordinary commercial life, not merely the instrument of formal legal proceedings. When two men agreed to a transaction, the sale of a piece of land, the settlement of a debt, the promise to deliver goods by a certain date, the agreement was routinely sealed with a sworn statement, a calling of God to witness that this thing had been said and this promise made. No solicitor drafted the agreement, no copy was filed in a registry, no email chain recorded the exchange of terms and the final confirmation. The oath was the paperwork. It was what made the transaction real and binding in any sense that a court could later enforce. And because the oath called God as witness, breaking it was not merely a civil wrong, a matter of one party having to compensate another for the breach, but a spiritual one, the kind of offence that a confessor needed to hear about and a penance needed to address. The whole commercial life of the town, the dozen daily transactions that kept a market town functioning, ran on the sworn word as its primary medium of trust. Among its many decrees was one that forbade priests from blessing ordeals. It sounds, in isolation, like a narrow procedural detail, a small administrative restriction on priestly involvement in a particular legal rite. But it was, in practice, fatal to the ordeal system. The blessing was the theological core of the procedure. Without the priest's blessing, the iron was just a bar of metal heated in a fire. The water was just water. The divine arbiter who was supposed to make the truth visible had no formal mechanism for doing so. English plea rolls show no ordeals after 1219. The practice did not fade gradually across decades of slow change. It stopped almost immediately because the church had removed the pin that held the whole structure together. What replaced it in the English common law tradition was the trial jury, local people hearing the evidence and delivering a verdict on what they understood to be true. The jury had a longer and more complicated history than any simple story of cause and effect allows, and its development was not a simple substitution for the ordeal. But the closing of the ordeal pathway is part of what pushed English legal practice in the direction of the jury, and the connection is real. The strangest rule for finding truth gave way, in the space of one generation, to something still recognizable in the courts of today. There is one more oddity in the medieval rules of truth that belongs here, because it sits in the middle of ordinary daily life rather than only in the formal court. The practice of swearing oaths was woven through medieval life continuously, before courts, in contracts, in promises between neighbours, in the small daily traffic of a world where a sworn word was among the most serious things a person could offer. And in the casual speech of everyday life, people swore by the body of Christ, by God's bones, by God's wounds, by God's nails, with a frequency that made preachers weary and kept confessors busy. These were not, in the medieval understanding, merely empty expletives. The popular theology of the period held that to swear carelessly by Christ's body was to do real violence to that body, that the blasphemous oath, uttered in frustration at a stubborn ox or a dropped tool or a piece of work that had gone wrong, wounded Christ anew in heaven, as if the passion were being repeated each time a careless word left a careless mouth. Preachers thundered against it from every pulpit. Penance was required. The sworn word was the foundation of the whole legal and social structure, and the word carelessly used in the barnyard was, in this theology, a small blow against the thing that held everything else together. The rules of truth ran all the way down to what you could say on an ordinary morning in a cart on a muddy road. The world of the oath was also the world of the curse, and they worked by the same logic. If swearing by God's name, sincerely and properly, called God's attention to a matter and made the truth visible, then calling down a curse was a real invocation of real power, not a figure of speech. Perjury was not a procedural offence in medieval understanding. It was a spiritual catastrophe, something that damaged the soul as surely as the wound in the ordeal's wound bed damaged the body. The man who swore falsely had put his eternal future at risk, not merely his legal standing in the current dispute. The oath helpers who swore for a man they privately knew to be guilty had done the same. The stakes of the sworn word were not merely social. In the framework of medieval belief, they were eternal. The jurors who eventually replaced the ordeal were also oath-takers, though of a different and more modest kind. They swore to find the truth to the best of their knowledge and understanding, not on behalf of one party, not as character witnesses, but as arbiters trying to reach a verdict. The shift from ordeal to jury was a shift in the locus of divine authority, from God acting directly on the body of the accused, to God guiding the minds of 12 men who had sworn to reason honestly. Truth remained, in both systems, a community enterprise grounded in the sworn word and the watchful eyes of people who knew each other and knew the local world. By today's standards, the distance from the ordeal to the jury seems enormous. No hot iron, no blessed pool, no divine intervention required to establish guilt. No aspirin for the anxiety of waiting, no antibiotics for the wound if it went wrong, no spreadsheet of oath helpers, no reputation weighed in the balance, and definitely no sense that God will intervene in the proceedings. What replaced all of that was evidence, argument, and the collective judgment of 12 people trying to think clearly. Different in method. Not entirely different in the understanding that truth is something a community must approach together, with the weight of collective responsibility behind it. The court, the ordeal, the 12 oath helpers, the blessed water, all of it was an attempt to answer the same question that every human community eventually faces. How do we know what is true among ourselves? Medieval people tried fire and water and the sworn word of neighbours. They changed their minds when the church gave them clear reason to change, with a thoroughness that is almost striking. By 1219, the ordeal was gone. The jury was coming. The sworn word remained. And the rules for finding truth, like all the other rules that shaped the medieval world, kept moving. Slowly, imperfectly, often in directions no one had planned for, but always in some direction, always being revised by the weight of experience and the pressure of events. The day's long catalogue of rules is settling now, receding into the background like furniture in a room where the candle has been turned very low. The statutes and the customs and the guild ordinances and the canon decrees, the statute of apparel, the assize of bread, the charter of the forest, the statute of Winchester, the banns and the indenture, and the courtesy books and the verderer's courts. All of it becoming shapes rather than words, textures rather than obligations, the comfortable weight of a world that had thought about these things. Beneath all the formal rules, beneath all the written law, ran a quieter grammar. A grammar of luck and protection and small daily acts meant to keep the world steady in ways that no statute could quite reach. Salt spilled at the table was bad luck, and everyone knew it, so you gathered the spill and threw it over your left shoulder into the face of whatever spirit was waiting there at your back to use the omen against you. The baker, before setting the loaves to rise, pressed a cross into the dough. Not only piety, but protection, a gesture that the flour and the water and the warmth of the rising all knew and answered. A horseshoe nailed above the door was iron, and iron was proof against things that wished the household ill. The envious eye, the glance of a neighbour whose admiration had curdled into something less wholesome, could be deflected by a whispered prayer, a piece of coral worn at the throat, a small gesture so old and so practised that it had long since lost its language while keeping its power entire. Some of this the Church blessed, and some of it the Church frowned upon, and the line between the two was blurrier than anyone who drew it was quite willing to admit. The cross in the dough was piety beyond question. The charm against the evil eye was, depending on who was asking, either a perfectly reasonable Christian precaution or something that needed examining more carefully. The world was full of powers, seen and unseen, and the rules for navigating them were not always perfectly mapped, because the powers themselves were not always clearly named or bounded. But there is something soothing in all of it, held at the distance that the night provides. A world where every small act had its protective rule, where you knew what to do with spilled salt, where the horseshoe above the door was doing its quiet work, where the cross pressed into the dough meant the loaf was cared for from the start, is a world where you are never quite alone with chance. The rules, all of them, from the grandest statute sealed with the royal seal to the smallest whispered custom passed from mother to daughter, were a way of saying, we have thought about this, we have made arrangements, the world is held together and tended. You are warm enough tonight. Safe enough. The fire is doing its slow and reliable work, and the darkness outside is the ordinary darkness, managed and familiar. The rules of cloth and bread and forest and night and trade and wedding and village custom and shared table and found truth are all behind you now, settling into shadow. The world that made those rules is very far away and very strange and oddly comfortable to visit in the quiet of a late hour. Everything in its place. Every morning beginning with a set of small known customs that were there before you and will be thereafter. A whole world held together not by one law but by a dozen, pressing in from every direction and somehow, in that pressure, finding its shape and holding it. The hearth settles. The small red watch of the embers glows on. Let the night carry you gently now, away from the statutes and the ordinances, away from the verderers and the wardens and the watch. Into the quiet that was always there beneath the rules. Into the warmth. Into sleep. Rest now, as they once did, held in place by the world they knew. sweet dreams.